You've heard their names, but I want you to know who they are if you haven't met them before. Kathy Matsui is Vice Chairman of Goldman Sachs. She's sitting to my left. To her left is Anoop Sagoo. He is the Group Chief Operating Officer for Growth Markets at Accenture. And finally, on the far left, my left, that is, your right, is Yumiko Murakami. She is head of the OECD's Tokyo Center. This is a conversation about macro, as I say, into the next decade. Here's one thing I would say about forecasting. It's pretty much anybody's guess, an educated guess, we hope. But if you ask 10 people for a macro outlook, you're likely to get 10 different answers. So instead of trying to predict what's going to happen next year or even into the next decade, we're going to talk about three of the newest and most potentially powerful macro forces on the Japanese and global economies. I'm talking about transformative technologies, climate change, and demographics. As you'll see, these forces are very much intertwined in sometimes unexpected ways. Kathy, demographics are the signature focus of your research at Goldman Sachs. For those of you who don't know, Kathy coined the term womenomics back in the 1990s to describe how an influx of women into the Japanese workforce could alleviate the structural stresses of an aging population. We got that more or less right? That's good. So here's where I'd like to begin. Kathy, tell us why it is demographics are so important, critical, if you will, to the macro outlook, not just here in Japan, but also elsewhere in the developed and developing world.
Sure. Is this on? Can you hear? Good morning. So to answer your question as briefly as I can, I think most of you are familiar with what are the three ingredients that drive any economy's growth potential, and they are labor, capital, and productivity. And if any one of those factors declines, then the long-term and the other factors stay static, the long-term growth potential of that economy is bound to decline as well, along with standards of living. And if you look at Japan, many of you are very familiar with this picture, but by 2055, i.e. in most of our lifetimes, this economy's labor force population will collapse by 40%. Today, already about 1/3 is elderly. The IMF estimates that if there are no structural reforms to cope with these challenges, then the economy's growth, actually GDP, could fall by as much as 25% versus their baseline projections. Did you also know that Japan is one of the few developed economies in the planet that has more pets than children under the age of 15? And I'm not counting hamsters and rabbits. I'm counting dogs and cats, which are the only pets that are measured. So what we looked at 20 years ago, in fact, was this idea of, well, wait a minute. When I went on maternity leave after my first child was born, I noticed that a lot of my mamatomo, my other mommy friends, were not returning to the workplace in the same fashion. And I thought, well, this is mottainai, this is a waste. And what if they would go back to the workplace in higher rates? And we did some calculations and found that, voila, there could be some very large economic gains to be had. So our most updated analysis, by the way, of this assessment is if you could close that gender employment gap, you could boost Japan's GDP by as much as 15%, which is not insignificant. And so many people have asked me in the last few, I guess, years, what exactly has changed? Has anything really changed? Because Japan is very slow to change. There's one thing, and I noticed that Governor Koike is going to be speaking later on today, and she tells this funny joke. It's actually an absolutely true story. The term daibashiti in Japanese, there's no Japanese word for it. It's called daibashiti. And she was at a conference many years ago, and it was talking about diversity and how important gender diversity was for Japan and its future. And then a gentleman in the audience, he's brave enough to raise his hand and ask, "Sumimasen, Koike-san, where exactly is this Daiba city? Where is this city called Daiba?" And she was just like so stunned. And that's how far we've come. Today, where diversity, daibashi, that term is now part of the Japanese vernacular. And also, did you know that Japan used to have one of the lowest female participation rates in the developed world? Now it is among the highest. It was 56% 20 years ago. It is now 71%, surpassing the rates of both the U.S. and the Eurozone. Number two, did you know that Japan has one of the most generous parental leave benefit systems in the developed world? Both the mother and the father get 1 year each of leave, and if you do the calculations, they actually get pre-leave take-home pay equivalent to about 80%. It would help if more fathers took the leave, but that's another issue. And then finally, there's been a lot of gains in transparency. 3 years ago, this government, shocking to me, forced companies to disclose gender-related statistics and set out goals. These are not quotas necessarily, but it's a beginning. Disclosure, you can't move that needle if you don't know where that needle lies. So I think there has been some movement. Of course, there is a lot of work to do. We all know about the dearth of women in leadership positions, not enough managers, not enough politicians. We have unconscious biases still very deeply embedded in Japanese society, not enough daycare, not enough caregiving capacity, on and on and on. But at least I think we've got the conversation going. And the context for this diversity discussion has moved, I think, away from a sort of CSR or human rights kind of context into the economic arena. It's become an economic and business imperative.
I'd like to bring Yumiko and Anoop into this conversation about demographics. Yumiko, at the OECD, you have an unparalleled point of view and perspective into what's going on in the developed world. Japan, at the very least, is aware of the fact that it's sitting on a demographic time bomb. What about North America? What about Northern Europe? What about China, for example? All of these economies are not producing children fast enough to replace the existing population. Is what's Japan experiencing going to play out elsewhere and perhaps faster and in ways that maybe we don't quite have a grasp on?
Well, I think you're right. Japan is really the leading country when it comes to demographic change, aging society, which, by the way, is going to be global megatrend. It is already global megatrend, but it's going to be even more pronounced in the coming years, next 5 years, 10 years, as you said. China, Singapore, Thailand, quite a few countries in Asia. Korea, for example, is another one. North America, Europe. So most of the developed economies, as well as some of the developing economies, they will face the same challenge as Japan is facing today. The interesting thing about Japan is not only this demographic tsunami is really coming now to Japan, but also at the same time, this technology tsunami is coming. So I think the interesting thing about this timing is the fact these two tsunamis at the same time attacking Japan. And if you look at these two tsunamis in a separate context, these are two mega trends that would have different implications. But because Japan is facing these two tsunamis, Japan actually can turn this around and say, this is an opportunity. The reason is, there are a lot, I'm sure we're going to talk about it, there are a lot of concerns in terms of what this technology tsunami might do to the economy in terms of job displacement, so on and so forth. At least for Japan, for the time being, we don't really have to worry about people losing jobs, at least for the time being. Again, it's not going to be a long term. We don't have a very long time window. But as you probably know, companies cannot find enough people in Japan right now. So in terms of automation or technology adoption, there is a very strong case that the society and economy can make without having an immediate negative impact on the labor market. So Japan should seize this opportunity and really see what technology can do to address that shortage of labor as a result of demographic challenge, which I think is going to be a very interesting case study for other countries.
That is among the most, if you will, optimistic takes on the impact of robotics, automation, machine learning, artificial intelligence that I've heard. Of course, it concerns, for the moment, the Japanese economy only this idea that as it becomes harder to find workers, well, as it just so happens, there are some technologies available to supplant them. Anoop, it's your job at Accenture to advise your clients, for the most part, large corporations, on technological advances and the changes in human behavior that they drive. I want you to talk to us about what your clients are doing, the technologies that they consider to be most important to adopt and to design into the workflow, but But I want you to start by telling us whether you've seen, in your interactions with CEOs, a recognition of what Yumiko just described, this idea that maybe the introduction of advanced technologies isn't as, might not produce such a catastrophic outcome for employment.
Yeah, thank you. Morning, everybody. I think firstly on the topic of the impact of technology on different types of age demographics, I mean, it is slightly different. There are some very interesting things going on even here in Japan when you start to look at what's going on with the thinking around Society 5.0, starting to think through, how would you create an environment to use technology to better create connected living, access to services. And I think it's things like that that will help aged population try and apply the use of technology in a very different way to enable them to access things in a more convenient and comforting manner. So in one sense, you could look at it in that way, although the funny story about that is I look at my own parents, and my parents have adopted new technologies very, very fast. My mother is famous for being a WhatsApp and WeChat expert as well. So it's quite interesting. You may find that adoption of technology with the elder generation is more sophisticated than you think. And then, of course, you've got the younger generation coming up, and they're more native. They're not trying to leapfrog existing traditional processes to new processes. The elder generation will want to go and speak to someone face to face. The younger generation don't work like that. I think you've all seen it in restaurants where younger generation is out and they're sitting next to each other and they're actually not talking. They're using messaging services to actually interact. So I think technology has to be applied in a different way, and if applied in the right way, I think it can be positive in both circumstances. Coming back to your question, I mean, our view is the impact of technology is positive and it is also very pervasive if used in the right way. And we are in a period of the world now, which I always like to look at Hollywood movies and compare all of the crazy technology that comes in the Hollywood movies and then compare it to what we're actually seeing in reality. And by the way, more and more of it is there if you look very, very closely. And that is happening, I think, because we're in a multiplier effect of technology. I mean, if you look at some of the actual tech itself, whether it's artificial intelligence, blockchain, robotics, the real catalyst in business today has actually been the cloud. I mean, what sits underneath a lot of these technologies is the ability to actually use compute power and use data and create more insight out of that. And that is actually what is driving the sort of multiplier effect that we are seeing right now. I mean, artificial intelligence is becoming more and more prominent in day-to-day work, and I'll give you some examples of that simply because the compute power is available to actually do something with all of the information. And, the pervasiveness of technology is fairly profound. You look at the agri sector and you look in very different corners of the world, people using technology now to increase crop yield and productivity. A couple of months back when I was in China, I even met a company that started talking about connected cows, which I still haven't quite worked out what that is. But that's the pervasive nature of technology. And in the developed economies, I think what we see is dealing with platformatization of industries to try and serve consumers in a more integrated manner. So whether it's telcos, banks, utilities, all coming together as consumers, we demand more integrated services. And in the developing economies, what we're actually starting to see is technology actually is the enabler to create micro-enterprises. It's allowing people to actually access services that they wouldn't normally access.
Kathy, at the same time as what Anoop describes is clearly happening, there is a growing fear of the pervasive role of big tech and three different ways, I would say, that governments around the world are responding to it, or at least societies. In Europe, for example, you have a very somewhat heavy-handed government response. In the United States, there's a little more freedom for companies to experiment and, as Facebook once said, move fast and break things. and then, for example, in an economy like China, a government-directed effort to try and introduce new technologies in a way that shapes and in some ways transforms society. There are pros and cons to each. From your perspective, which is likely to be most effective, broadly adopted, and specifically in the Japanese context, how should this economy be thinking about that approach to technological change?
So, I mean, this is not a house view by any means. It's just my own personal thoughts on this subject. But I think that given the demographic landscape that I just outlined earlier, I don't think this country has the luxury of choosing. I think the reality is very clear that the numbers are shrinking. I would also add that, as many of you who are working for Japanese larger companies know, that from April of this year, we're now subject to hatarakikata kaikaku, which are work style reforms, which is a euphemistic word for we now have a legal cap on overtime hours for our junior staff. We have been measuring, I've been measuring at Goldman Sachs. I get a spreadsheet every month of our juniors and how many overtime hours they're working every month. Because the labor authorities are going to be inspecting us, as they will be inspecting a lot of large corporations. And so on top of the demographic headwinds, you also now have the inability to squeeze, endless hours of from each individual person. So the reality is the productivity it's imperative that productivity has to improve. And how are you going to do that if you don't adopt a lot of these technologies? And of course, governments around the world are grappling with how do you regulate the technologies, how do you ensure that they're not invading privacy and taking personal information and abusing that information. But at the end of the day, I think for this country in particular, there's, again, not much option, at least for now. I think it's up to the Japanese regulators and government authorities to determine what is the right path, what kind of regulatory framework is optimal for at least taking advantage or leveraging these new technologies to boost productivity, which is absolutely imperative, but at the same time protecting everybody's sort of concerns on these matters. It's a fine line, it's a delicate balance, but that's my own personal view.
Yumiko, I'd like to go back to you now because the world, at least the world in modern history, has had to deal with technological change before. We've seen the Industrial Revolution. We've seen the transistor era and the computer age that it brought about. And of course, we've seen demographic shifts as well. What man has never had to grapple with before, again, in modern history, is climate change. How do you see climate change becoming and asserting itself as a macro force?
Well, I guess it's a very timely topic as we watch discussions in Madrid, Spain this week at COP25. The thing is, I think that we've been talking about it for a long time in terms of the urgency of climate change. And unfortunately, these talks are not translating into actions, at least not in a timely manner. So you probably know that the greenhouse gas emissions are still increasing. Last year, for example, energy-related greenhouse gas emissions increased after 3 years of a plateau. So things are not changing as quickly as they should. Now, long-term impact of climate change we've been talking about, it's really not long-term anymore. We see it on a daily basis. I think it was just 2 weeks ago, the top 3 Japanese non-insurance companies announced the downward revision to their profit forecast for this fiscal year on back of the higher than expected losses from the natural disasters that we had this summer, i.e. Mega typhoons. And by the way, these 3 companies went through exactly the same thing last year. They experienced unprecedented levels of losses last year from flooding typhoon last year. And these companies now being forced to increase premiums. And that is, that's a very clear and present, risk. And quite frankly, it's making everyone difficult, right, in terms of the cost of business operation. So very simple example, but that kind of example you can find almost everywhere, every country. The good news is, I think that capital markets are responding. You probably know, most of you are here in financial services, the ESG investment category, that's the one of the fastest growing asset classes in the capital markets on a global basis, I think reaching somewhere around $30 billion last year. Japan is still a relatively small portion, roughly $2 billion. But the good news for Japan is the growth rate is the fastest. So it went from less than $500 million in 2016 to over $2 billion last year. So that's a pretty impressive growth rate. It makes me really optimistic because Japan has a number of very exciting technologies. We talked about NIDEC before. This country has a great technology. So when the capital market plays its role in terms of pushing these investments into the right places where the right technologies are there waiting for investments, I think the upside is extremely exciting. So we're starting to see that. And that makes me feel as if Japan actually should be one of the most interesting countries when it comes to technologies, when it comes to investments. Another thing that I would mention is being latecomer to this game sometimes gives you benefit because there have been so many comprehensive academic studies and surveys, including OECD, that have been done in this area. So now we know for a fact there's a very strong correlation, positive correlation between ESG investment and strong corporate financial performance. So we don't have to say, is it really going to happen? It's definitely proven. So I'm hoping that this is going to be a very big theme in 2020, not only for Japan, but in terms of global ESG investment trend.
Anoop, I want to come back to you in a moment, but Kathy, it looked like you wanted to
I was
say
just going to add to Yumiko's comments, because if we look at our client base, and of course many of you are working in institutions that really care about ESG, but my colleagues just wrote a piece, and they said that the signatories to the UN's PRI, the Principles of Responsible Investing, GPIF, for instance, is a signatory to this. They have required their signatories to integrate ESG into their investment factors or factor process, at least half of their AUM. So if it's GPIF, at least half of GPIF's AUM must apply ESG factors in their investment processes. And if you think about this, it's not just impacting the momentum for climate change, it's also impacting, for example, gender diversity. Because of what I said earlier, why is the Japanese government requiring Japanese companies to disclose gender statistics? This is actually one of the reasons why, is because now it's being measured by asset allocators, not just here in Japan, but globally. And I would also add that the G of the ESG is super important, of course, here. I used to say, corporate governance in Japan was like an oxymoron. I've been doing my job for 30 years, and it was just kind of a joke. And now companies and asset owners are finally taking this issue seriously. Why? Because those asset allocators are distributing capital to companies that care about governance and not giving it to those that don't. So again, our analysis shows that ESG alone does not produce excess returns necessarily, but is a very important risk mitigant for asset managers. So I think this is a really burgeoning trend, which I think is going to be a tailwind for some of these big picture issues and trends that we've been discussing.
So over time, we might actually see that on a risk-adjusted basis, the returns delivered from an ESG compliant or sensitive portfolio may be superior.
Exactly. Of course, you can't just be ticking off the boxes, and that's a big debate, right? If you're just ticking off boxes, it's just superficial, it doesn't really mean anything. But if you really genuinely are taking actions to move the needle in some of these areas, on top of being competitive in your industry and having high returns on equity and that kind of thing, that combination of the two can generate very powerful returns.
Anoop?
Yeah, I was just going to make a comment on the technology angle here. I mean, our own research shows that, the C-suite, in becoming more sort of savvy with what's needed to understand their impact, do see that technology plays a very, very critical role in helping them to achieve two things. Number one, sort of visibility of the impact that they are having. A lot of large organizations struggle with getting visibility on the complete supply chain and the complete traceability of how their business works. So there's a dynamic around that, which is I would put into the visibility category. And then there's the actual impact, and actually using technology in a very different way to actually adjust the impact that you are having. And some of the really interesting examples of this are, where towns are using something that we like to use a lot in the tech world. We talk about digital twins a lot, which is effectively a sort of virtual model of their own towns to deal with the impact of natural causes such as floods and the like, and actually using technology to model the impact of that so that they can not have to immediately go and drill in more drains to sort of allow the water to sort of flood. So I think if used in the right way, technology can play a role both in providing the traceability of the impact, but also actually the impact itself. And it can be used in fairly prolific ways now to really think through very creatively. And it's at that level where people are starting to use tech to deal with things differently.
One more note from you. In your interactions with clients and CEOs, do you find that there is to what degree do you find that there's a genuine interest and concern for the impact of climate change and a willingness to adopt, let's say, ESG as more than an overlay for altruistic purposes? Or is it simply either purely opportunistic or simply defensive?
I mean, I don't know whether some of this is also us as a service provider to a lot of these organizations, but if I look over the past 1 to 2 years on many of the large transformative programs that we've run, where we've sort of been helping organizations to digitize the way that they work, almost in every circumstance there is actually a sustainability work stream. I mean, in the work that we do now, it's often actually called out as a specific work stream, and it's there in every program that we're doing. So, I mean, we see a lot of visibility, actually. Organizations who are looking to get into the digital economy, looking to do cost optimization. Sustainability is always there as a factor, and frankly, in a lot of our tech-related services now, from organizations like us, you will see us coming forward with more sustainable related service offerings that integrate that with sort of traditional technology.
Before we wrap up this panel, any final thoughts from you, Kathy, or you, Yumiko?
I think Japan is an exciting place now. The World Rugby was amazing in terms of how people are just watching everything that was happening in Japan. And next year we're going to have Tokyo Olympics. So a number of very high-profile international events. I think are making people realize, hey, Japan is an interesting country to watch from overseas. So I think 2020 is going to be a very exciting year for Japan. And I think that these international sports events, these are just triggers. I do think Japan actually really can step up and play even bigger leadership role, whether in a political context or economic context. I think that can be a very exciting sort of outlook of the new year for not only Japan, but also for the entire region.
Well, if we had had this conference 8 years ago, 10 years ago, who would have guessed that Japan in the year 2019 would have one of the longest, most stable leadership governments in the developed world? That is quite a shock. But seriously, if we think a little bit ahead beyond next year and think of transition, a lot of clients ask me, but Kathy, what happens when Abe steps down? Are all of these structural reforms? We talked about governance. We talked about technology, society 5.0. Won't they go in reverse, right? And that is, I think, a genuine concern. Nobody knows what's really going to happen, but my guess is that two forces. One is geopolitical vulnerability. We don't really talk about this subject in forums like this, but I think it is super real. It is my personal view that this country is sitting in the most geopolitically vulnerable position since World War II. And if you think about the long-term implications of this for its economy, if you have an economy that's stuck in no growth or in a coma, good luck, right? You're going to be even more vulnerable. So I think the urgency to get this economy growing, to get people a little bit more optimistic about the future is super real. And the other force, of course, is debt sustainability. Okay, we've all become accustomed to zero interest rates or negative rates. That ain't going to be the case forever, though. At some point, rates will go up. And then what happens to this debt burden that Japan is having to cope with? So I think these two forces are going to continue to keep the pressure on, not guarantee that structural reforms will continue, but I think that imperative to address those really big issues is going to continue, no matter who's, frankly, leading this country.
Great notes to end the panel on. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking our all-star panel, Kathy Matsui, Yumiko Murakami, and Anoop Sagoo.